What's up everybody, hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our channel sponsors International MTG on TCG Player, as well as Martin from the Hobby Horse. We've also started a new Discord channel which is free to join, so come hang out with us. Link in the description of this video. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you a game that we filmed a couple weeks ago down at the Hobby Horse. This week's game features Martin playing his newly built rat deck being led by Totentanz Swarm Piper, Ryan playing his exile-based Doctor Who deck being led by the War Doctor and Clara Oswald, Foggerl playing his mono-green pit fighting deck using Silvos Rogue Elemental, and Patrick also playing his mono-green bear deck featuring Ayula Queen Among Bears. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Martin pays 2 life to play an untapped Blood Crypt before casting a super sick turn 1 Soul Ring. Ryan plays a mountain, immediately tapping it for Relic of Progenitus. Fog draws and plays a forest. Patrick plays a snow-covered forest before passing his turn to Martin, who plays a tapped Temple of Malice return, scrying 1 card, keeping it on top of his library. Martin then pays to cast Lord Skitter's Butcher, choosing to have it come into play with an additional 1/1 Black Rat token. Ryan plays a Bright Climb Pathway for turn before he then pays 2 and casts a Talisman of Indulgence. Fog just plays a second forest and passes. Patrick plays another snow-covered forest, then taps out in order to cast his commander, Ayula. Martin draws for turn and then goes to combat, swinging 1 rat apiece over Ryan and Patrick. Both players then take their damage and Martin taps out to cast Mirkwood Bats. Ryan plays a Swamp for turn before tapping out in order to cast his commander, the War Doctor. Fog plays another Forest for turn before tapping out in order to send his Beanstalk Giant on an adventure so he can go get a forest from his library to put into play tapped. Patrick plays another snow-covered forest before paying 3 for an Owlbear Cub, which then has him choosing to put 2 1/1 counters on his commander. Martin draws for turn and then goes to combat, choosing to swing his bats over at Ryan while he swings his 2 rats over at Fog. After damage, he then taps out and casts Redcap Gutter Dweller, which has him creating 2 more rats when it enters play and deals 2 damage to each of his opponents. Ryan plays a second mountain for turn before paying 3 for Cunning Rhetoric, and then an additional 2 to cast a Talisman of Hierarchy. Fog plays another forest for turn before paying 2 for Joriel Mawavi Recluse. Patrick plays a snow-covered forest before casting a Savage Stomp, choosing to have his commander fight the Gutter Dweller. The Sin adds a counter to his commander and sends Martin's creature to the graveyard. Martin plays a mountain for turn before going to combat, swinging his bats over at Patrick while he swings Lord Skitter's Butcher over at Fog and his 3 rats over at Ryan. This then has Martin exiling the top card of his library to Ryan's enchantment, before Ryan then blocks 1 of his rats and everybody then takes their damage. Martin then casts a Grave Shifter targeting the creature in his graveyard to bring back to hand, and in response, Ryan exiles it with his relic. This then has Ryan putting a counter on his commander before he starts his turn. Ryan then plays a Plains for turn and pays to cast an Uba Mask. Ryan then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Martin, using his commander's ability to shoot 1 of Martin's rats. Martin then takes his commander damage and Ryan passes. On his upkeep, Fog exiles the top card of his library. He then plays another forest and passes. On his upkeep, Patrick exiles the top card of his library. He then taps out in order to cast Hunter's Edge from exile, putting a 1/1 counter on his commander, choosing to have it fight Ryan's commander. Ryan's commander then goes to the command zone and he passes. On his upkeep, Martin exiles the top card of his library before he then taps out in order to cast the exiled Old Flitterfang. Martin then goes to combat, swinging all of his available creatures out equally at each of his opponents. This once again has him exiling the top card of his library to Ryan's enchantment. Everybody then takes their damage and he passes. On his upkeep, Ryan exiles the top card of his library, playing it as his lane for turn. He then casts Martin's Saga from exile, which has each of his opponents then creating a 1/1 Black Rat token, which then has each of Martin's opponents taking 1 damage from a token entering play. Ryan then follows it by casting Ryan Sinclair. On his upkeep, Fog exiles the top card of his library and then plays another forest. He then pays 6 and casts his commander Silvos and passes. On his upkeep, Patrick exiles the top card of his library before he then pays 2 to cast Rain Through. He then uses this targeting his commander and Ryan's Ryan Sinclair. Ryan's Ryan then goes to the graveyard and Martin remembers he should have created a food token which has him dealing 1 damage to each of his opponents. On his upkeep, Martin exiles the top card of his library before then paying 3 for Chittering Rats, targeting Ryan. Martin then sacks his food token in order to gain 3 life, dealing 1 damage to each of his opponents. He then decides to go to combat, swinging all of his creatures out at Ryan, which has him exiling the top card of his library to Ryan's enchantment. Ryan exiles the top card of his library before he uptakes his Saga. He then casts the Dothy Voidwalker from exile as well as Martin's Rune Rat. On his upkeep, Fog exiles the top card of his library before then paying 1 to cast the Infiltration Lens. He then pays 3 for a Fire Shrieker before paying the 2 to equip it to his commander. Fog then goes to combat trying to take Ryan out of the game, which then has him exiling the top card of his library to Ryan's enchantment. Ryan then chooses to cast the Ambuscade, targeting his Death Touch Rat and Martin's Mirkwood Bats. But then he decides to save himself instead, choosing to target Fog's commander. This then forces Fog to tap 1 to regenerate his commander, removing him from combat. On his upkeep, Patrick exiles the top card of his library, before he then pays to cast Anelia's Intervention, where X is equal to 1. He then goes to get a snow-covered forest from his library to put into play and pass his turn. On his upkeep, Martin exiles the top card of his library, which he then plays as his land for turn. He then casts Voracious Vermin, which gives him another rat token when it enters play, dealing a damage to each of his opponents. He then finally taps the rest of his mana in order to cast his commander, Totentanz. Martin then goes to combat, swinging all out at Ryan with all of his creatures, which then has him exiling the top card of his library to Ryan's enchantment, before Ryan then dies to combat damage. Fog finally gets to draw a card for turn before paying 1 for Strength Testing Hammer. Fog then pays to equip his commander with the Strength Testing Hammer, before he then also pays to equip him with an Infiltration Lens. He then chooses to go to combat, swing his commander over Martin. This then has him rolling a 6-sided dice, which comes up as 6, which then makes his commander the largest creature on the field, which has him drawing an additional card. This then triggers Jor-El, which has him creating a 2/2 Panther token, before Martin then goes to blocks, blocking with his commander, which has Fog drawing 2 more cards. Martin then gets taken out by commander damage, and Fog plays the forest for turn. Finally, Fog casts an Animus Might, which has him targeting his commander and Patrick's commander. This then has Patrick's commander going to the command zone, and Patrick realizes he's going to be dead on Fog's next turn, so he just scoops the game up to Fog. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.